Well, Simon, we made it to the end.
Made it.
We made it. And I want to start by thanking you for being involved in this project. We started talking about this a few years ago, didn't we? Realizing we had a mutual interest in it. And for me, it's been a real value to have someone else involved in synthesizing the literature and coming up with the structure for the content. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciate your involvement. And the first thing I wanted to ask you was, how do you think we did?
Well, thanks for asking me. I know we did talk about this a while ago. And first off, when you asked me, I thought this would actually be pretty easy. Like you said, I teach this stuff, you teach this stuff. We'll just put our notes together.
Yeah, easy peasy.
It was surprisingly hard. There's so much material. And as soon as you start digging into one area, you just find more and more stuff. And it's not that you get more and more answers, you actually just end up with more and more questions.
It felt like that, didn't it? And, I felt as we were going through the course, we kept saying we need more research and we don't have any conclusive answers, but that's really the conclusion that we have to come to.
Yeah.
So I think the exercise was valuable in that sense. And I think we also spoke numerous times about how surprised we were about how much there was. And I think that was reflected in how expansive the course outline got. Like we just kept adding stuff and saying, well, this seems relevant too, so we should add this.
Yeah, I don't know. How many papers do you think we went through?
I haven't added it up yet, but it's a couple hundred, I think. I'm not sure what the number is. And the goal that we had was to come at it from a perspective of not cheering for one particular mechanism or another. At least that's how I interpret it. Was there anything that we found throughout the course that surprised you?
Outside of how much there actually is and how much there keeps coming, I did find in every section there was a little bit more information than I thought there would be. Like there's more markers. There's so many markers, especially in...
There's a lot of substances in the body.
So many markers that scientists are looking at. And honestly, I have to look up every one every time I read a paper. There's just always a little bit more where it feels like the more that they talk about, the more I feel like I don't know really what's going on.
Right. And it's interesting to see the authors themselves kind of reach that conclusion at the end of their own papers. And I think there's a degree of scientific responsibility there for these authors to put their results in a reasonable context. And for the most part, I think everyone did that. I don't think we ever sat there looking at a paper saying, well, we disagree with their conclusions. I think there's a good degree of humility in the research community in this space.
Yeah, or it's the reviewers, they don't let them say certain things
Well,
before they get published.
So the humility may be artificially added in the peer review process. That's a good point. For all the content that I make on my service, I'm always looking at when do I want to update this course. And now that we've been through this monster, to me, this is a really big topic to tackle because there's so many different types of research. It's very dense in a way, and I think that's why it was also nice to have two speakers presenting this, and I hope that the viewers enjoyed that as well. But when we're looking at when are we going to revisit this topic, what do you think we need from a research perspective to move the needle on some of our conclusions or to come to any conclusions at all? What do we need here?
Yeah, we've talked about this in Starbucks because every time we'd come to a topic, especially where it's a physiological study, they're looking at a particular biomarker and it goes up or it goes down after an adjustment. My question is always, okay, you have these physiological responses and we know that patients have reduction in pain, reduction in disability on the far end. And I gave kind of that bullet point answer of what happens during an adjustment. However, there's like a big black box in the middle where I don't know for sure that all these physiological processes that are changing after an adjustment are the reason. So I think there was maybe one study that started to do that where they had both the clinical outcomes and the physiological outcomes.
Yeah.
I think that's the future. Like if you want to talk about the really cool brain stuff where you're seeing changes in brain waves and motor patterning, let's bring that into how does that affect a clinical population and are those changes correlated? So if we see changes in brain waves, does that mean good or bad stuff for a particular population?
Right, and what does a blip in a certain brainwave mean if all we have is an indication that it occurs very temporarily?
Yeah, good point. I would also like to see like longer term
Yeah.
studies, and not only like you did an adjustment, what happens 3 days or even a week later, but you go through a trial of care, which some of the scientists do, and like, does it change from baseline from day 0, and then you did a trial of care for 6 weeks, and did it change over time?
Sure. And I think another relevant question is what happens to patients who see a chiropractor for 30 years?
Yeah.
And that's tremendously difficult to study. But the thing I think we need in the literature, and we've talked about this as well, is projects that connect some of the different disciplines we've looked at. We reported on a couple of papers that looked at biomechanical parameters of the thrust and how that might influence biomarkers or something else. And the difficulty there is most of the researchers only work on one thing or another, and we don't have many of them that, span more than one category. But I really think, to your point of connecting these outcomes to clinical importance, we also have to see if some of these mechanisms actually work together, or if there's really more than one mechanism involved at the end of the day. And I think we both think that, we just don't have all the pieces yet.
It would be really cool to start combining different inputs and seeing, is the output different, both on the physiological side and the clinical side. But you mentioned something that jogged my memory. A lot of the cool research that we talked about using the servo robot, they were able to control very specifically the input of the adjustment. And I think one of the limitations is they could only apply a certain amount of force.
Right.
I talked to some of the scientists up in Quebec, and just the current setup and machine doesn't have the capability to accurately and consistently apply large forces really fast. And I think as soon as they have the equipment to do that, then you can start looking at some of the spectrum of what you see in the chiropractic world in the 400, 800, and even 1200 Newton ranges. What does that do?
Right.
And not only to physiological processes, but what does it do to like patient comfort and other clinical outcomes, and maybe even the patient didn't expect 800,
Right.
And they expected 4, or vice versa. The patient said, you hit me with 250, and it feels like I need 600.
Right, because patients normally report to us if we use too much force, or not enough force rather, but if we use too much, they often don't say anything.
Yeah, they just
Right?
don't come back.
They just don't come back. And finding that sweet spot is hard with some people,
Yeah.
and it's a trial and error. And the research now can't point us to a definitive answer of what type of patient needs what type of force either.
Right.
Because that's the other thing about trying to standardize these experiments is all the subjects you're putting on the table are different human beings. So standardizing the force is one thing, but as I said at the beginning of the course, you can't standardize the subjects either.
No.
And as soon as you involve a clinician doing hands-on therapy, there's a whole other layer of variability there. So it's a really challenging thing to approach, but I like this idea of combining the different parts of the model to try and get us to a more succinct answer, or for us to be able to tell our audience that we do know more things about specific mechanisms, or we can be a little more confident in what we say to our patients.
I have a question for you. You presented some of the stuff on patient expectations and how that can alter outcomes. What do you think about that research, and where do we need to go with that?
So I think patient expectations, I always frame from a referral patient perspective. All chiropractors get referrals to their office. Most of the time, that person is referred because one of their existing patients had a really good experience. You never eat at a bad restaurant and then send your friends there, or you never go to a bad dentist and refer your friends, right? So I always,
don't.
Yeah, exactly. You're a nice guy, though. But I think the ultimate compliment that we can get from our patients is when they send their friends and family to see us. The good news about referrals is they come to your office with a pre-existing expectation that you're going to help them because their mom, their dad, their wife, or whoever told them that you were amazing. And I think that is the way that people grow successful chiropractic practices, is building a huge referral network based on positive patient experience and reasonable management of patient expectations. So I think that area, in a way, is relatively easy to study. And I think we could actually tack that on to a lot of the research models that we currently employ, is ask the patient in advance what they expect from their care and see if it matches up. And as we covered, it often kind of helps predict improvement, doesn't it?
I think it does. And I wonder if I was designing a study, could we bring in a bunch of patients, and then some of them we tell them nothing, or we just talk to them about something that has nothing to do with the chiropractor they're going to see. And another one who just talks up that chiropractor, like, oh, it's the best chiropractor. Or you have like a waiting room where there's patients and pretending to be a patient, and like, oh, this is the best chiropractor in the world. And then maybe in another stream, you have a negative patient. Oh, I can't believe I'm seeing
or someone limping out of the treatment room.
Yeah, and then see, like, does that change the immediate effects and maybe even down the road?
Yeah.
That would be a cool study.
It would be kind of a theatrical study to do, but I think that would be an interesting model. The results are predictable in a way, aren't they?
Well, I know my hypothesis, yeah.
Yeah. I have a question for you.
Shoot.
When we look at the research that we covered in this course that kind of goes against what we were taught, like the pop location and how specific we can be and how things are actually working when we're doing this, in combination with the contextual factor research, I've noticed some of our colleagues get a little bit defensive because the models they were taught in and the models they treat in are kind of being chipped away at a little bit. How should we feel about that?
Well, I'm sympathetic. So
yeah.
What I was taught in school and then started practicing as an intern, and some of the things I still practice today don't necessarily match with everything I read. And like you, I read a lot of research that suggests that maybe what I think about what I'm doing isn't correct. Mm-hmm. However, I think there's a delineation there where just because what I think I was doing is not how it works doesn't mean what I'm doing doesn't work.
Right, of course.
Right? So when I know the research suggests that static palpation and motion palpation is not very reliable. Like if you look for a restriction and I look for a restriction, we tend to disagree.
Right, yeah.
More than agree. However, I still do that because I think there's other reasons that that's beneficial. For example, I talked about in the course where I'm finding areas where patients are like, oh yeah, that's the spot. Mm-hmm. If I don't do that with my patients, I lose that opportunity for communication, which who knows, maybe that communication is a really important part for that patient.
Right.
So I think as research comes out and helps us understand that this theory is probably not correct, doctors shouldn't get disappointed about it. They should get curious. Like, if that's not correct,
what else are we doing?
What else are we doing
sure,
that's
yeah.
maybe working? And then I know that some very experimental chiropractors, they'll go ahead and try to just do the opposite.
Right.
That's rare, but they'll try it. And sometimes they realize, oh yeah, that thing that I thought was important is actually not so important.
I think the defensiveness arises sometimes in the challenge with changing well-entrenched behaviors and beliefs. And I think some of the mechanisms that we talked about where the evidence isn't quite as supportive, a lot of our colleagues hold them as deeply held beliefs. And that sort of depends on where you went to school or when you went to school. But I think there's a bit of an element of that too. People are just unwilling to change, especially if they've been in practice 30, 40 years, for example. But I've always thought that healthcare providers should come out of school and into practice with the idea that you're not the doctor now that you're going to be in 20 years. And I think even the way we look at different types of research and interpret it and apply it to practice has changed from my perspective. I've become a little more easygoing in a way about how we apply things and what can move the needle for a practicing clinician. Maybe that's maturity, or maybe that's a bit of frustration or just experience. I'm not sure what it is, but I feel like I at least wanted our colleagues to feel good about this course, and I hope we were able to do that insofar as we still have a ton of unanswered questions. So do you think we hit the mark on that one?
I think
are people watching this gonna feel good? Do you guys feel good? Do you feel good?
I don't know if they're going to feel good because, again, there might be some cognitive dissonance, and that never feels good.
Right, yeah.
However, one paper that got a lot of attention was the NIM study where they compared areas where you're looking for the segment that's clinically relevant or you're adjusting away from that segment. And their conclusion was you can adjust the segment that you find clinically relevant and patients get better, and you can adjust away. And I think that...
And they probably still get better.
And they probably still get better.
Mm-hmm.
But that does create cognitive dissonance from what I learned, where it says you need to find the area and treat that area, not treat 5 segments away from it, right? That's not what I was taught. But I've reframed that in my mind to saying, well, sometimes I don't get to treat the area, or my patient says that's too tender,
Sure.
or I don't like that adjustment.
Sure.
And I think, well, there's research to suggest I could adjust lower down or
Correct, yeah.
higher up. And I actually think it's a good thing. It provides more evidence-based options for me versus I can't do the thing I know works because what I was taught before is probably not something I need to know anymore.
Right. And concepts like that speak to the idea of a systemic effect of what we're doing rather than a local tissue effect. Mm-hmm. And I talk to Casper Nim quite frequently. He's done a couple of reviews for me. And when I asked him about what's the importance of specific location for manipulation, his answer, we talked about this at one of our meetings, was it's probably more important to the doctor than the patient. So that shows us how firmly we hold these beliefs sometimes, and we're a bit unwilling to let them go. But I think in some ways this new information frees us a little bit and allows us to open more doors for investigation.
So in putting this course together, what were you most surprised about when you were going through it?
It was similar to what you said, just the simple volume of studies that we have. And in an effort to keep on top of the literature, of course, I'm going to miss things here and there. And having you by my side here helped me backfill a lot of areas that I may have missed a little bit in. And, the conclusion that we need more work in a lot of areas is not terribly surprising to me. But I think the breadth of research that's happening in a variety of different areas is really exciting for the future. What are you excited about going forward in this area?
Yeah, there's a few big topics, or topics that I think will become big. One, what happens to the inflammatory markers and inflammation? So could we look at patients who we know have inflammation, and does spinal manipulation change that? And is it the same in different populations? My guess is no. We already know chronic and acute low back pain do not react the same.
Correct.
So more stuff like that, and I think we're going to see more. That reminds me, I have a question for you. Is there a body fluid, do you think we need to study more?
I think definitely more urine.
More urine?
No, I'm just kidding. There were tons of bodily fluids that we covered in this course, and maybe when we update the course, there will be more work in that area. Yeah. But I think that ends our time for the course and for this section. So again, we want to thank you for joining us for this, and I want to thank you again, Simon, for your help. And I think we'll do this again, won't we?
Sounds good. Thanks, Shawn.
Thank you.